History as it happens, November 22nd, 2022. The First America Firsters.
On a clearly American issue, we stand a united nation. It is only when we are asked to take part in the quarrels of foreign countries that we divide.
Should the United States be required to carry indefinitely the full burden of defending rich and prosperous allies who take America's generosity for granted as they invade our markets?
We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Donald Trump's worldview has a long lineage in our politics, although he's updated it for the 21st century. Unilateralism rather than isolationism, still undergirded by a deep distrust of international agreements, free trade, and open immigration. To understand today's America Firsters, let's visit the first America Firsters. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
As the U.S. becomes a commercial and military power in the world, these debates, these longstanding debates about how to balance foreign and domestic commitments take on a whole new set of stakes, right? They're so much more potent and meaningful. It really is a question of what is the meaning of America in U.S. foreign relations? What is the meaning and project of the U.S.? Is it interventions? Is it transformation of other cultures? Is it fulfilling its ideals at home?
So when was the last time you heard anyone describe themselves as an isolationist? Not peace activist or pacifist or skeptic of military interventionism. I'm talking about an isolationist. Probably never, right? Well, there are so few isolationists around these days, you might find it hard to even define the term.
I argued that there's basically two main branches of isolationism, political and protectionist. And the main difference between the two is obvious. The protectionist isolationism very much centers on questions of avoiding full free trade and creating trade barriers of particular types in order to advance domestic industry, agriculture, or other targeted areas of the economy. Within that, I've argued that there's a number of other strains of isolationism. Two of the most important are non-entanglement and unilateralism. So not getting entangled in foreign affairs, not getting entangled through binding agreements and alliances and organizations, and unilateralism, a real visceral as well as intellectual prioritization of acting alone in the world, prioritizing national sovereignty.
Christopher McKnight Nichols is a historian at Ohio State University, an expert on the history of the U.S. and its relationship with the rest of the world. And he is the author of Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. So it seems you need a time machine to go back in time to find some real isolationists. What about politicians who promise to put America second? Well, the implication of an America First platform is that the establishment does put America second or third or fourth. The establishment, however defined, is too concerned with the rest of the world, too willing to send our soldiers to die in other people's wars, too concerned with promoting trade rather than protecting our own manufacturing. Maybe the most famous isolationist in American history was Charles Lindbergh, but he gave an infamous speech in Des Moines, Iowa in September 1941, remembered for its anti-Semitism and Nazi sympathizing.
In selecting these three groups as the major agitators for war, I have included only those whose support is essential to the war party. If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement.
3 months after that speech, the U.S. would be at war, and the America First Committee disbanded. But before this disrepute, isolationism was the dominant foreign policy ideology in the United States. A diverse group of citizens who pointed to the country's long tradition of neutrality, broken by its misguided involvement in the First World War, they argued. Isolationism receded after 1945 as the U.S. emerged from the war a superpower leading multinational institutions. But it didn't entirely vanish. Pat Buchanan updated America First for the post-Cold War world when he ran for president in 1992.
All the institutions of the Cold War, from vast, permanent U.S. armies on foreign soil to old alliances against communist enemies that no longer exist, to billions in foreign aid, must be re-examined.
And then Donald Trump put his own twist on it in 2016.
Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs.
Trump preached hostility to immigration, opposition to free trade, and distrust of alliances, and multilateralism more broadly. He never called himself an isolationist. Maybe unilateralist was more like it. America first, meaning America should go it alone. So as you know from listening to recent episodes, I've had a lot of conversations about the roots of modern right-wing populism in our country. It is not fascism. It is not European in nature. It didn't come out of nowhere in 2015 with Trump. Just give a listen to the episode titled Buchanan's Party if you haven't already. These ideas have been percolating in our politics for generations. Christopher McKnight Nichols, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on with you.
Well, as you know from listening to a couple of my recent episodes, I've been on this subject lately. So let's begin at the beginning and the very first America Firsters, or actually the person who may have coined that phrase, maybe. William Randolph Hearst, or did he borrow it from Woodrow Wilson? What's going on there, or what went on there?
Yeah, so some folks like to say that Hearst coined it, and obviously he helped popularize the term. Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1916, both used America First in their campaign platforms. They mostly meant it in terms of immigration, but also in terms of rallying people. He kept us out of war, that famous slogan for Wilson, but really focusing inward on the U.S. and on American problems. But, hey, start at the beginning, ask a historian. I'm going to give you a deeper, longer dive into this. So in my research, I found the first invocations of America First go back to the 1880s in the U.S. You particularly find them in Republican progressive politics on the West Coast. You find them in Oakland, California. I'll toss this one out at you. A paper ran a headline, America First and Always, and that was with reference to trade wars with the British. You find in the 1890s some similar stuff, Wisconsin, the Upper Pacific Northwest, declarations of prioritizing the U.S. over other powers or other nation states. And why are they doing this? One is because of the massive waves of immigration, right? So this is when you're getting lots of German Americans moving to the upper Midwest and moving through the West Coast. There is a sort of reshaping of the Republican Party in this moment. Young people are coming up. So it used to be the old abolitionists ran the Republican Party, and now it's the next generation. It's Teddy Roosevelt, it's Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. It's these folks. And they're having a bigger vision of what the U.S.'s role in the world should be. So this America First set of ideas comes out. And a key part of that is actually limiting immigration. And that's one of the through lines you see through William Randolph Hearst, who is pretty pro-German in the World War I context, and that you see in terms of both Wilson and Hughes in 1916. And we could keep going all the way through the 20th century.
William Randolph Hearst opposed U.S. intervention in World War I, which begins in 1917. He was also against American membership in the League of Nations. So he was an isolationist. But we need to talk about isolationism because today that word carries a negative connotation. It's almost un-American. How can anyone be an isolationist given the U.S. role in the world since 1945? But we're going to go back to this era, early 20th century, when isolationism was the majority view for U.S. foreign policy. It was a diverse and large constituency. So why don't we talk a little bit about who were the different kinds of isolationists in America in the early 20th century?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And I think it points out how complex this history of the idea is, the different kind of political formulations and formations around this. In 1898, the U.S. has this war with Spain, winds up annexing a whole lot of territories, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, getting protectorate status over Cuba, and we could go on and on. In 1898, there was an anti-imperialist league in the U.S., one of the largest foreign policy lobbies in U.S. political history. That and the America First Committee in 1940 and 41 are two of the most potent anti-war foreign policy lobbies in the U.S., and it was a really heterogeneous group of people who were in the anti-imperialist league. You had Mark Twain, you had Andrew Carnegie, you had W.E.B. Du Bois, you had Jane Addams. You had a host of people from across the political spectrum. And one of the main arguments they were making was that the U.S. shouldn't be an empire like England. As a rising power like Germany, it had a responsibility as a democratic power not to rule alien peoples against their will, not to rule by fiat, and in fact, to prioritize within. So you see lots of political cartoons from that era that make the kinds of arguments that we hear later about America First. Hey, civilization begins at home would be one way they would put it. Hey, we need to reform at home to fulfill democratic ideals at home and not go abroad trying to spread them. So it's a first kind of argument against nation building as we would understand it much later. And it comes from all over. As you move through early in the century, what you find related to these ideas about isolation, and one of the things that's important here is as the U.S. becomes a commercial and military power in the world, these debates, these longstanding debates about how to balance foreign and domestic commitments take on a whole new set of stakes, right? They're so much more potent and meaningful. It really is a question of what is the meaning of America in U.S. foreign relations? What is the meaning and project of the U.S.? Is it interventions? Is it transformation of other cultures? Is it fulfilling its ideals at home? Now, obviously, these are somewhat false binaries. You can do some of each, but the way foreign policy arguments tend to be made, they go through that. So if you think then to the World War I moment, the first time the U.S. is engaged in a war on the European continent, this was verboten in the old isolationist ideas, right? Washington and Jefferson did not want the U.S. engaged in European politics, power politics, or war.
We were neutral. We were neutral from the first days of the Republic.
Totally. Yeah. So their big worry was, entangling alliances, collective security deals, right? The kinds of things that traditional isolationists oppose. And we can get into that definition. But in the World War I moment, Wilson immediately declares neutrality, prioritizes America first. He uses those terms. And then eventually, through his set of policies and through the ways that the war unfolds, the U.S. gets into it. But one argument related to isolationism in that period is that to explain why the U.S. doesn't join the war between 1914 and 1917, you have to understand the power of these ideas about staying neutral, about focusing within, about not committing troops and resources abroad. And, one data point that people don't usually know, hey, the U.S. never had any formal allies in World War I. It fought as an associate power, right? Its troops did not fight under the flags of foreign powers, which shows you just how powerful those ideas were, I think.
It was the Entente versus the Central Powers. Axis and Allies is the next war. And I'll also note that the America First Committee that we're going to be talking about comes later on. That's World War II. But this idea of America First had been percolating, as you just explained. Farmers, unions, industrialists, newspaper publishers, they were among the isolationists. Let's talk about farmers for a moment, because also at this time, as the United States is a burgeoning economic and military power, there is the idea that we need foreign markets for our goods, that for the United States to continue to grow, our own domestic market is not enough. And wasn't that something that farmers would have been interested in, foreign markets for their produce?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the arguments you get in the late 19th century, in the 1898 moment, is that the U.S. needs access to foreign markets for its agricultural product, but also for its burgeoning industries, right? And so all these small nascent industries that had been protected by protective tariffs, which is another thing that isolationists tended to like, went hand in hand. So farmers and industrialists hand in hand and thinking about new markets. Absolutely. The flip side of that is the other directionality of what might come from abroad. And so that's where you see this sort of border making project of isolationists and farmers and labor organizers arguing against immigration, right? So one of the interesting things about this moment is that left labor leaders like Samuel Gompers are functionally isolationist in their opposition to immigration. Why? Because they want higher wages for their workers, but also out of these sort of highly racialized politics saying some workers are better than others, some races are better than others. And so they want to limit who can come in and who can work for those reasons as well.
So would you agree then that farmers were, by and large, part of the isolationist lobby?
It depends on the area. So that's the other thing. I'll be very particular. So the U.S. South, right before World War I, was really dependent on the British Empire. They were exporting their cotton. And so you get right after World War I begins, the U.S. South gets very briefly pro-British because they want the British to win rapidly so they can keep exporting their cotton, and then flips as there's a downturn to become much more pro-German. Your Midwestern farmers who had more North American and continental trade actually were a little bit less interested in foreign markets. And then you have farmers on the West Coast looking to the Pacific and being more interested potentially in markets across the seas. So actually, when you slice this, you find several different kinds of farm demographics depending on the era and their interests. But as a basic rule of thumb, I think you could say in the early 20th century, farmers had an interest in foreign trade, but had a much more isolationist orientation towards prioritizing domestic policy and politics.
I really appreciate your remarks here because it shows how complex isolationism was. I think a lot of people today think it means no wars or don't get involved in wars. But isolationists were not pacifists. We're going to get into that as well. So one more note before we get to the America First Committee. What underpins isolationism, or what makes it the strongest foreign policy constituency in the country after World War I and into the 1920s, was the notion that American involvement in that war was a disaster, was a failure, was unnecessary, right?
Yes. That is exactly right. So one of the things that's really amazing when you go back to the actual primary sources, the documents, the arguments of the early World War I moments, and then coming out of the war, is just how many Americans thought it was not the U.S.'s fight. They wanted to go back to old ideas about what the best U.S. foreign policy should be. So they wanted to go back to Washington and Jefferson and Monroe, right? This idea in 1823 that the hemisphere was the U.S.'s sort of sacrosanct place. It had a major role to play in interventions and governments in the hemisphere, but not so much abroad. So not across the Atlantic or the Pacific. The kinds of ideas, updating ideas about prioritizing the U.S. and its interests and not getting engaged in European power politics were really powerful. One of the things that most people who don't study World War I as closely as scholars like I do don't know is that in something like 7 or 8 states in the U.S., once the draft begins in 1917, you had to federalize the National Guard and bring them out because of the number of draft dodgers. World War I was not a popular war in the U.S. It was not popular for most Americans. It certainly wasn't popular for those subject to the draft. And it didn't look necessarily like a war the U.S. had to fight. In other words, it seemed like a war of choice. And when you get to the other side of that, the rethinking of the U.S.'s role in the war in the 20s and 30s is absolutely critical to understanding the rise of isolationist ideas in that period.
And if anyone hoped that the outcome of the First World War, with the Entente winning, might open up new markets to American producers, they were also disappointed too, right? Didn't happen.
Yeah, very much so. So, what's interesting, one of the formulations that I like to think about U.S. foreign relations in the 1920s is that it's engagement without commitment. That the U.S. is engaged with the world very much in commercial and cultural terms, but not so much committed to the League of Nations, international diplomacy. There were Americans, many of them very idealistic, fighting to end war in the 20s and 30s. Some come out of an isolationist orientation, in fact, and some come out of a much more globalist internationalist framework. None of them thought that they lived in the quote-unquote interwar years, right? That's us reading back through time. Many of them were hoping that the most cataclysmic war in human history had been the Great War, and they could stop that next one. And the U.S., by limiting its engagement in the world, would actually be, or limiting its commitments to the world in diplomatic and military terms, would actually be an agent for positive change.
Wow. I think it's safe to say U.S. not being involved in the League of Nations doomed the League of Nations. Whether the U.S. involvement in it, if that had happened, would have avoided another war. I mean, that's impossible to say. Probably not. I mean, I don't know. But we'll get to the 1930s now and why the America First Committee comes about. Because the world does change, and we have the Nazis marching across Europe in the late 1930s. And there must have been a sense that at some time, sooner or later, the United States was going to get involved in some way with what was going on in Europe. And that's why the America First Committee is formed, right? Because there's a fear among isolationist constituencies that the United States, by helping Britain, whoever, is going to get involved in this terrible war.
Yes, precisely right. So,
which begins in 1939, September 1939. But go ahead.
Yeah, so well, let's roll that back slightly through the 20s and 30s. So the first really epithet versions of the term isolationist or isolationism to tar opponents of a particular foreign relations arise in the 20s and 30s. You can see some uses of the term that come before, but really this is the period that it matters the most. We live very much in the shadow of that today. Almost no one will take on the mantle of being an isolationist. As you've noted, right, already, atavistic, a throwback, like it's foolish.
Living in a
naive,
fantasy
insular.
world, we have 800
Yes.
bases all over the world. It's kind of impossible to be an isolationist in that regard, but go ahead.
Yeah. And Jane Addams would have said the same thing. The first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize would have said the same thing in the 1920s and 30s. You can't be fully isolationist. The world is globalized, even then. But to think a little bit about what the term meant or what we might mean by the term and how it functioned, this was a hope to deploy what had worked in the past and update it as a foreign relations strategy. So it meant avoiding entangling alliances, collective security agreements, international organizations, be they trade, diplomacy, or otherwise. And then a sort of sub-theme, and I write about this in my book, Promise and Peril, a sub-theme of that is related to minimizing war. They're not, as you noted, necessarily pacifist in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, in the America First Committee, the founder of the American Legion is one of the major figures. I mean, a very hawkish pro-military figure. But as the 20s moves into the 30s, one of the big questions for the folks who become America Firsters in 1940 and 41 is Congress, are the people having a full say in U.S. foreign relations and politics? And you see this in the late 19th century, too. So some of them are pushing for a referendum on war. They don't want Congress to make war. They want people to make war. And the argument there is the people are the ones who serve in the battles. They actually fight these conflicts. And you also see a deep skepticism of special interests. And these are things that resonate with us today, I think, and one of the reasons why isolationist ideas in general are so powerful. So in the 1934 to 1936, you had a North Dakota congressman named Gerald Nye, had this series of committee hearings. And one of the things that comes out of that in rethinking how the U.S. got into World War I was a real attack on the so-called merchants of death, what we would now think of as the military-industrial complex. So the intersection of the military-industrial complex, special interests, and finance, making this huge war bet in World War I, roughly 800 to 1 on the British and the French by 1917 when the U.S. gets into the war. These are the kinds of historical lessons that the America Firsters learn. And you can find this in their pamphlets, and you can find this in their stump speeches. We entered World War I, and that was deeply flawed. We should not have done it, they will argue. And then they say the same is happening again in 37, 38, 39, 40, 41. We see it.
And the reasons for their opposition to involvement in European wars wasn't just an abstract notion. It was, well, first and foremost, the cream of the young generation will be killed on a battlefield, right? The death and the carnage. But what were some of the other reasons? I mean, you touched on it there. There was an idea that this money should be spent on building up our own country, right?
There's one central thing that the America First Committee argued for, and nothing else. And it was to keep out of the war. If you look at their papers, if you look through what they agonize over at meetings, they're formed in the summer of 1940 in New Haven through a bunch of then Yale undergrad and law school students by R. Douglas Stewart, who was a scion of the Quaker Oats family, and have a very heavily Midwestern flavor. The vast majority of the chapters and members are from the Midwest. Of the arguments that they make, they say, okay, we're not going to endorse political candidates. We are not going to be a partisan organization. We are not going to endorse a particular foreign policy or course of action, except stay out of the war, stay out of the war at all costs. So one thing that's interesting about and mistaken about thinking about the America First Committee is that they had fully formed political menu of items, candidates they endorsed, things like that. Their local chapters did all kinds of different things, but as a national set of policies, that was their main one. So what they thought, the corollary ideas there, what they thought they would aim for was to keep the U.S. out of the war, to prioritize U.S. defense, so to not give weapons or material aid of any kind that would then be essentially spent by foreign powers. If the war came to the U.S. had to be prepared.
They wanted to build a fortress America, right? They wanted to basically make North America an impregnable fort.
Yes, exactly. And you see this, actually, it's a through line after the war. Herbert Hoover, for instance, in 1950, argues that the U.S. should create its own base structure such that it's like a Gibraltar in the hemisphere. Yeah. And the Fortress America argument had a real updated kind of appeal. It's not some backward-looking isolationism, right?
So let's get to the origins of the AFC, the America First Committee. You talked about a little bit there, the Yale students, because some of its later members and positions have given a very bad historical reputation. The anti-Semitism, the fascist sympathizing. We'll get to that. But first, it sounds like it started off as a peace movement, an idealistic peace movement. I'll just cite a paragraph here from Glenda Gilmore and Thomas Segru's book, These United States, page 229. Those who organized and joined the America First Committee in the fall of 1940, so World War II is underway, but the United States is not involved. Pearl Harbor is not for another year, believe that they practiced a sort of realpolitik, while their parents and grandparents followed a foreign policy forged by outdated traditions that tied America to a feudal Europe. Yale University students organized the committee when they returned to school after the eventful summer of 1940, and it grew to be the largest U.S. peace movement in history, claiming 800,000 members in 450 chapters. So a peace movement. But what happens after that? Who takes it over?
Yeah, so that's a great jumping off point. The first sort of leadership is a guy by the name of Robert Wood, who was a retired U.S. Army general and the chairman of Sears Roebuck. There's a host of others involved in leadership roles. One of the most important things to pull out there is how many pacifists, socialists, writers, intellectuals, former politicians, industrialists, and others are part of it. In the early days, you get figures who become later very important individuals. John F. Kennedy gives them $100, I think.
Gerald Ford.
Yeah, Gerald Ford, Potter Stewart, Sargent Shriver, but also Norman Thomas, famous socialist candidate for president.
So left and right across the spectrum.
So, I think that gives one a sense, at least to particularize this, that though it gets castigated as a racist, anti-Semitic organization, and there are some very good reasons for that, when it begins in summer and fall 1940, it does look like America, right? It's a broad organization. In fact, one of the things that they didn't understand, actually, was they thought they'd be just a small group in New Haven with some allies. And then they realized, oh, wait, we're becoming a membership organization. But they have no formal capacity to do membership rules. They have all these different branches. But, so one of the things that we historians often note is we have to take with a big grain of salt, skepticism, their own claims about their membership, because it could have been more, it could have been less. We really don't have great data on that. And I think the Gilmore-Segru line is a good one. They claimed roughly 800,000. We know there were over 400 chapters, but the vast majority were around Chicago. And exactly how many, we're not entirely sure. But just to give you a sense of what they argued, because I think this is really important. So in the summer 1940, here, I'm pulling out my primary sources as a good historian.
And I'll just quickly interject. Summer of 1940, France has already surrendered to the Nazis, and Britain is on its own. Go ahead.
Yes. Effectively, you're looking at a world where it's the British are left hanging alone, and the U.S. needs to find its own course. And it does not seem so wise to create alliances with an embattled England. One of the things, for instance, that Charles Lindbergh often says is the U.S. can't fight England's war for itself. So you're exactly right to point out that critical moment. Just to give a sense of the AFC's public efforts, and that they were more diverse than you'd think, but also more limited than many would think. Here's the four main positions that they took. The U.S. should, quote, concentrate all energies on building a strong defense for this hemisphere. That's Fortress America that you just spoke of. That, quote, American democracy can only be preserved by keeping out of the war abroad. And this is partly what united pacifists with conservatives and all kinds of figures in between. The AFC would, quote, oppose any increase in supplies to England beyond the limitations of cash and carry. And this is really important. We can dive into that because such a policy would, quote, imperil American strength and lead to active American intervention in the war. And that is all about how the U.S. got into World War I.
And you hear that today with the debate over aid to Ukraine. Well, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. I think there's a lot of striking connections to the near past and then there's one more, and this is the most important: a demand that Congress refrain from war even if England is on the verge of defeat.
Wow. From our vantage point today, these ideas were on the wrong side of history, right? They got it wrong. But at the time, and we'll know this because the Lend-Lease bill, right? Doesn't just sail through Congress. It takes 2 months of debate. 2 months of debate. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So that, that's really what they're talking about when they're talking about cash and carry and the way the FDR administration seems to be taking a kind of imperial presidential position. Lend-Lease, they're getting this access to bases from the British and essentially giving them destroyers, although technically they're lent.
Yeah, they're outdated. And they're outdated, too. But yeah.
They're outdated. I mean, they're not the combat-effective vessels that you'd want, but part of what the British are getting out of that is slowly pulling the U.S. into the war. And every skeptic of that intervention is very worried about that. And if you're a belligerent, right, if you're Germany and you see the U.S. giving destroyers to your enemy, that's one more nail in the coffin of getting yanked into the conflict. Congress is not positive on this. There were these neutrality acts that tried to bind the hands of the administration. Cash and carry is part of that the U.S. shouldn't be trading with belligerents. This comes directly out of these hearings in 1934 to 36 we were talking about, but also, lessons of World War I. There's a large group of people who worry the Roosevelt administration is pulling the U.S. into the war for their own reasons. America Firsters are especially upset in August 41 when FDR meets secretly with Churchill and issues the so-called Atlantic Charter, which pledged the U.S. to be part of the defeat of the Nazi tyranny. That's a rough paraphrase, but almost exactly right.
No, you're right. The AFC, America First Committee people, start taking on a darker worldview, if you will, start espousing more conspiratorial ideas as to why the United States is moving toward war, really helping Britain defend itself against the Nazis. I mean, this committee only sticks around for about 15 months. We won't skip ahead to the end of the story. It's Pearl Harbor that basically puts an end to it all. But at some point along the way here, they go out to Charles Lindbergh and ask him to join. He seemed to have a strange relationship with the committee, and this is where, Henry Ford had already been part of it, and they got rid of him because of his anti-Semitism. But Lindbergh starts to deal with these anti-Semitic and conspiratorial ideas. Why was the committee attractive to anti-Semites?
Yeah, well, there's one natural connection that there was real German sympathizers within the group, many of whom were persuaded by either their own, frankly, racism or German propaganda related to the Jewish cabal running the U.S., trying to get the U.S. into the war, or more broadly, just anti-Semitic kinds of sensibilities. I mean, I think just to briefly contextualize too, right, Henry Ford is one of the most famous early adopters, and they push him out of the AFC. But there was also a person named Avery Brundage, who's the former chairman of the U.S. Olympic Committee. Brundage had prevented 2 Jewish runners from running on the American track team in 36. That Olympics that we all think of as this vaunted moment of American sort of multiracial egalitarianism.
Marty Glickman.
Yes.
Was one of them. When I was a kid, just a brief digression. When I was a kid and I started listening to football on the radio, I had no idea who Marty Glickman was. I was a kid. I didn't know he had been around for so long. When I first heard his voice calling Jet games, he sounded so young and vibrant. I had no idea that was the Marty Glickman from the 1936 Olympics.
Exactly right. Yes. And so if you think about this moment of anti-Semitism, it's shot through American society. It's shot through American politics. The U.S. State Department notoriously doesn't use all the visas it could have to help get Jews out of Europe. In fact, the St. Louis is turned back around, and most of the individuals on the St. Louis die either in concentration camps or from a variety of other elements. So this is a moment, a real stain on Americans of all shapes and sizes and political persuasions. It should be no shock then, though, that with the sort of pro-Germanness of quite a few folks involved with the AFC, and the German-American Bund is part of this, that you'd get a few more anti-Semites in the group. But this really tars their message, and they know this. You can see this in their internal meetings. And originally, in those very first days, there were more Jewish Americans, prominent Jewish Americans as part of it. But as you noted, right, Lindbergh becomes the face of the organization. He's a major figure in American public life. He can bring out huge crowds, which they really want to get their message out. So he slowly ramps up over the course of his time on the stump for the AFC, especially in 1941. And the big moment here.
Des Moines, Iowa.
Des Moines, Iowa, exactly. Des Moines, Iowa, September 11, 1941. And he says that there's 3 groups that are coming for the U.S. that are really the ones pressing the U.S. into the war. And they are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. And just in that one blast, right, saying that there's this cabal, and you also see in different AFC publications at this moment an internal stab in the back going on. So this speech, when he gives it in Des Moines, immediately prompts a firestorm of criticism. And you get a wave of resignations from the AFC. It's really the final turning point. It's why we remember the organization and their ideas as we do. Wendell Willkie, the GOP presidential candidate in 1940, said it was the most un-American thing he's ever heard.
That's right.
I mean, that's kind of hard to believe, but nevertheless, it's very un-American in the World War II context, right? It's about to happen.
He's making excuses for Nazis. I'll just share a passage from Jill Lepore's book, These Truths. She's quoting Lindbergh here, who fiercely opposed communism. I would 100 times rather see my country ally herself with England or even with Germany with all her faults than the cruelty, the godlessness, and the barbarism that exists in the Soviet Union. Lepore goes on to write, his fevered anti-communism left him blind to other kinds of ruthlessness. He offered excuses for Nazi propaganda. Lindbergh said, in time of war, truth is always replaced by propaganda. I do not believe we should be too quick to criticize the actions of a belligerent nation. There's always the question of whether we ourselves would do better under similar circumstances. And then he confided to his diary that the press in the United States was controlled by Jews. Most of the Jewish interests, said Lindbergh, in the country are behind war, and they control a huge part of our press and radio and most of our motion pictures. So no surprise there that, he brought disrepute upon the committee, even though anti-Semitism, as you said, was pretty strong in the United States.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he argues, even in that speech itself, the greatest danger to this country, direct quote, lies in their Jewish large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, our government. It's a very distilled, impossible to avoid anti-Semitic message. And coming as it does at a critical moment, you don't know that yet in September 41, but as you approach Pearl Harbor, it's really exactly the wrong time to be dividing the U.S. in that way. And coming through the summer where there had been all sorts of gains for the Nazis, at this point in summer 41, they're awfully close to Stalingrad and Moscow, and they're on the march. And so there's a strong argument for the AFC to argue in the sort of realpolitik of the world in that moment that the U.S. should really be conserving its resources because the war is going to come to the U.S.'s shores. But instead, you see a lot of the AFC members, and Lindbergh isn't the only one making this case. There are others doing this too. They're aiming their fire internally. It's a terrible political message. It's racist as well, of course, but it's really deeply ineffective. And so they undercut any possibilities they might have had. And, this is a moment, too, if you look at the polling, still the majority of Americans as late as September and October don't want to enter the war.
I wasn't aware of that. I was about to ask you, actually, where public sentiment was. Well, maybe they didn't want to get into the war, but probably they're thinking with everything going on, it's a matter of time. So December 7th, 1941. So that's it for the America First Committee. It basically shuts down, and Lindbergh actually starts working for the administration, right? Or he changes his tune.
He does. He volunteers. He wants to go immediately into combat. And you guessed it, FDR does not want to give him a platform for that right away. But eventually, he gets to serve about 50 combat and combat-related missions in the Pacific.
Well, that's atonement there. There were also more traditional thinkers, right, who opposed intervention, like Ohio Republican Robert Taft, the senator. Lepore says he was prophetic in saying that, depending on the outcome of the war, the United States is going to wind up permanently in Europe as a policeman.
Yep, precisely. Yeah, actually, the current book that I'm writing is about Taft and Eisenhower in the early Cold War.
Oh, wow.
And he and a number of others, he becomes Mr. Republican coming out of the war. He's the face of the Republican Party and conservatism. His arguments are that the U.S. should stay for as long as possible, stay out of the conflict, don't overinvest in it, and be prepared then to pull back and demobilize as soon as the war is over. What he really didn't want to see was what you described a little while ago, the U.S. as a entangled giant around the world with 800 bases.
So isolationism is what? Discredited, killed off? I mean, what happens after 1941? Does anyone admit that they're an isolationist anymore?
Well, so I was going to say, I pulled one more thing. I don't know how salient this is, but General Robert Wood, making an argument in fall of 1940, engaged this explicitly in a speech of his delivered before the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, where he argued that there's two schools of thought in U.S. foreign relations, have been, currently are in 1940 and would be in the future, interventionists and isolationists. So he didn't contrast internationalists and isolationists, but interventionists. And he said, look, we isolationists in the AFC are not interventionists. We're anti-interventionists. We're non-interventionists. And he argued that, these terms aren't exactly good descriptions, but because not all interventionists are the same and not all isolationists are the same. But the big question for the future in that moment during World War II and moving forward would be balancing the two, the kind of interventionism and isolationism. And even if we don't give a lot of credit to the sort of thinkers involved in the AFC, that is very much what emerges after the war. So one of the things I argue in a couple of my books is that, look, We falsely have this watershed. World War II is the good war. You come out of it, and there aren't people who are skeptical, and there aren't good positions about changing the U.S.'s relationship to the world that are about the limits of power, that tap into old isolationist ideas like self-sufficiency, like neutrality, limiting binding alliances and other structures, trying to minimize war, not ruling alien peoples against their will. And we could go on and on, some of the constituent ideas of isolationism. Pearl Harbor happens. What happens to the AFC? Well, in the first book that they produced that comes out of this, Ruth Starles, who's the main secretary for the organization, was there from the founding moment. She argued, quote, "Our principles were right. Had the U.S. followed our principles, war could have been avoided."
Yeah, we told you so.
Yep.
Well, I don't know if I buy that one.
I don't either, but they stuck to it. And you can see these folks through the whole rest of their careers, because so many of them were really young. They keep sticking to it. So you'll see one of the arguments of where did isolationism go? Hey, it's all over the place. Because these conservatives, especially, who stuck with the AFC to the very end.
Here's the hard part, linking what we've been discussing here to our current moment. Pat Buchanan, the Cold War is over, so he resurrects America First in his 1992 campaign. He's thinking directly about 1930s isolationism. He was a paleo-conservative, right, in his 92 campaign?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think he's resurrecting ideas about America First, and then very self-consciously attempting to update them for a new era, right, for the post-Cold War era.
Yeah, he writes revisionist histories about World War II that were criticized for kind of going easy on the axis. But go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I think tracking this over time, you see ideas about isolationism viable in 1952 when Taft is running for president against Eisenhower. He very self-consciously writes and thinks about how to limit U.S. engagement, does not like the Marshall Plan, is not very happy with the Korean War, is not happy with NATO. So these particularly conservative positions about the limits on U.S. power abroad are palpable and enduring and popular. You know, he would have gotten the Republican nomination in 52 if Eisenhower hadn't run. A lot of the individuals within his orbit are people like John Bricker, congressman from Ohio, who tries to pass this Bricker Amendment, which was basically in the 50s an attempt to do what Congress wasn't able to do in the 30s, to bind the hands of the president, the war-making powers of the president. And you can think about the same thing happens in the Vietnam era. Critics of the Vietnam War were also leveraging anti-interventionist, more isolationist kinds of arguments to push back against Cold War hubristic interventions. And they also bring the left and the right together in interesting kinds of configurations. But then the post-Cold War moment is the best time to see this. You see immediately emerging people like Buchanan attempting to say, look, the costs have been too much. The base structures, the military engagements, the binding alliances, what are we getting from this? We've borne too many burdens.
And now the Soviet Union is gone, so it's time to look inward.
And the direct connection between that, Soviet Union's gone, we've borne all these burdens, but we shouldn't pay all the prices. Again, sort of this inversion of JFK. You see that through line then through the 2000s to the Trump presidency as well, right? The sense that the burdens of these international organizations and commitments are too great.
Make NATO pay.
Yes. U.S. pays too much into NATO, or in the other way, they aren't fulfilling their agreements to put 2% of GDP into their military commitments. But the same is true with some of the binding trade agreements. One of the things that isolationists have argued for throughout U.S. history since the late 19th century is more bilateral trade deals and not multilateral ones. They think the U.S. can get more out of that. That's very much what we saw both in a kind of Buchanan version of unilateral foreign relations and in a Trumpist one.
Well, one important point here is that there are many ways to be involved in the world other than the projection of military power.
Yes.
And I don't consider myself an isolationist, but man, am I tired of interventionism, especially preemptive war. I mean, who could argue with the critics who point out what the past 20 years have wrought across the world with the global war on terror, a catastrophe?
That epithet of isolationism, I think, an isolationist is why a lot of people want to reject the term. They don't even want to have this conversation. They want to say, let's talk about the core ideas like pacifism or anti-interventionism and that sort of thing. But I think we need to pay attention to the term isolationist because it has so much power in American political life and rhetoric. And it's how you disregard, reject, castigate opponents of any kind of interventionist or internationalist policy.
And it's a way of saying what kind of country the U.S. should be. When you say I'm an isolationist, it transcends some of these other words.
It does. And it's also maligned, mistreated, and misunderstood, right? So this history that we've been tracking through is much more complicated than this backward-looking kind of island nation thing. You know, no isolationist in the American political record, I often say to audiences, ever advocated for a completely walled and bounded U.S. I have not found one thinking advocate of isolationism who did that. They all recognize what you said earlier. Look, the U.S. is engaged globally. It's engaged in the hemisphere. It cannot do anything other than that. So the question becomes, how do you balance foreign and domestic, right? What are the principles that guide that? And that's what isolationists are arguing for. The core principles of democracy at home come first, however you define them. And then you can get to other kinds of projects.
And you can make an argument that the United States needs to be more engaged in the world when it comes to nuclear disarmament. When you think of the historic treaties of the Reagan-Gorbachev era in the early 1990s, so many of those treaties have either expired or been abrogated, and the world is backsliding in that area. We're seeing nuclear proliferation with the Russian buildup and the Chinese buildup. I'll get off of my soapbox.
Yeah, well, you bring up a great point. So here's one of the challenges for isolationist kinds of arguments, or if you want to call them unilateralist, that might fit a little bit better for sort of what Trump and Buchanan were arguing for. Some problems are global commons problems, which require global participation and collaboration. Maybe you don't want it to be the U.S. leadership, but the U.S. has to be a partner in that kind of
climate change, nuclear weapons.
Climate change. Yes, right. And human rights to some extent. There's a host of other kinds of issues. When an isolationist or unilateralist position rejects that participation, collaboration, or leadership, then you have a vacuum. Is there an expectation that China or Russia will fill that vacuum, will actually help push those kinds of agenda? No. I mean, I think that's unreasonable for any of us to think of in the present, just like it was unreasonable in other eras to think that some other major actor would do the same. The Soviet Union or the British Empire in the 20s or 30s, the British couldn't do it anymore, right? And coming out of World War II, the British literally say that, and that's how you get the Truman Doctrine in 1947, saying the U.S. will support free peoples anywhere that they're under attack from communists or subversive agents. So it's a really interesting kind of question. That's where the limits of isolationism lie internationally, or in unilateralism. And then there's a corollary at home, which is really insidious, which is that it's very often nativist and xenophobic. That by prioritizing the people in this place, they're saying very often fewer people are welcome from abroad. And that's why the term isolationism has been tarred so significantly, particularly because of some of these moments where America first, as a term, as a catchphrase that embodies a lot of isolationist ideas, has been bandied about.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to return to reassessing the end of the Cold War. We recently dedicated a couple of episodes to the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev. Up next, we're going to take a look at the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
There's a new book claiming that Reagan, as much as Gorbachev, brought the Cold War to an end and collapsed Soviet communism. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.